Hmm.
Hello.
Hey, how are you?
How are you today?
Good, good. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we are recording
Of
this
course.
session too, so you know.
No problem whatsoever. How many people do you anticipate today?
About 20.
All right. That should be a good group.
Yeah, yeah.
Obviously, the 20 people who are showing up had nothing better to do for an hour. Um, so they decided to show up and listen to me instead. I can see this. All right.
I am going to grab my lunch to eat during this hour though, so I'll
That's
probably turn off my picture so you don't have to watch me eating.
that's perfectly okay. You
But
having anything? You gonna have anything good, by the way?
I make a salad,
All right. That's
yeah,
okay.
with honey mustard dressing
All right.
and deli turkey, and it's delicious.
Wonderful.
Oh, glad to see everybody. See, David made it today.
I did make it, and I signed in about 5 minutes early just to make sure.
There we go.
We've all had those days. Everything went wrong a few weeks ago. I had a doctor's appointment that I got stood up on, and the doctor made me wait, for an eye exam. I mean, just I won't go into the detail, but we've all had bad days, and so that was one of them.
Ah,
Now I don't know about the rest of you. I know while we're waiting here, during the pandemic, we all had to try to figure out how to turn part of our house into a studio or something like that. And this is sort of like a bedroom upstairs kind of study, whatever. Probably not the best lighting in the world, but we've all sort of have tried to figure out how to do what we can do.
given the court challenges, you're not only going to have to report on what happened, you're going to have to guess what's going to happen in terms of talking about the last election.
Yeah, I know. I think the one down in Scott County, I think it wraps up today, doesn't it?
I don't know when it wraps up. I just know it's on.
Yeah, I think today's supposed to be the last day of testimony. Um, and It was interesting yesterday because they had six individuals, and obviously the names have been sequestered for all kinds of privacy issues here, who testified and said that they voted for the Democrat. If that matters to the judge, then mathematically it's impossible for the Republican to have won. But whether or not that's a material fact, I don't know.
This one.
Where did the ballots go?
Sounds like in the garbage,
Well,
unfortunately.
well, who was collecting them or who was doing it?
And that's part of what they're trying to figure out at the hearing here is that it's it's 20 or 21, and it's still not certain, that came in. They separated them from the envelopes, but for some reason and again, this is where it gets a little muddy. For some reason, the 20 or 21 ballots were disposed of. I think they've retained the envelopes, the outer envelopes. But I've heard, but it's not clear. I mean, I've heard some other accounts say they're not completely sure if they can trace back the disposed ballots to particular individuals. So a little bit of question here, which is part of what the judge has to figure out is what are the actual facts in the case.
I would agree.
Yeah. The part that I thought was most interesting, well, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things, is listening to the person who's the basically the elections official down in the county and just basically conceded and said, I'm not quite saying this was a real major mistake, but essentially saying this was a real major mistake in terms of what happened here.
Well, I think in this day and age with litigation, the way that it is, everybody looks for the exception of where they can lodge a challenge for or discredit somebody or whatever.
Yeah. We've always had these small amount of errors in our election system, but when we weren't so polarized, when elections were not this close, they didn't really get magnified. But now when the elections are just so close in so many situations now, again, I mean, it's an incredibly small number of errors, but those small errors
become major problems.
Yeah, I know. What's that old story for was it want of a nail? A battle was lost, and it goes from like want of a nail, a horseshoe, kind of works all the way up. It's like, I can't remember how that poem goes or something, but it's sort of like what's going on here.
Well, we probably have the people we're going to get for the most part. Just want to remind everybody we are recording this session so we can post it on our website afterwards.
Thank you, Margaret, for all you do.
And I'm ready to go when anybody else is, unless you have anything else you need to say. All right, let me get started. Thank you all for coming today. And what I want to do today, well, what I really would like to do is I've got probably 3 different talks that I want to give in terms of getting you to think about what just happened in the election and what it means going forward. I'm going to do my best to try to weave 3 different things together. So one is I want to talk a little bit about obviously what just happened, mostly at the national level, but eventually tie it into what it means in terms of Minnesota. But also in the process here, I want to think about not just about who won, who lost, which I think is important, but I think what's even more significant is what are some shifts that are going on. And I'm going to introduce you to some political science concepts in the process here. All right, so now let me get started. And I want to leave enough time, by the way, for lots of questions for you folks to be able to ask me, because that's usually the most important part here. Now, one of the things I like about the fall teaching at Hamline University is that early in the fall, or in the start of the year, I should say, I've got first-year students. I'm teaching kind of like an introduction to political science class. And on the first day of class, I say to my students that political science is actually quite easy. And I say to my students that political science comes down to 3 tasks: describe, explain, and predict. I say to my students that our first task as a political scientist might be similar to what it is for a journalist, simply describing who voted for whom, who won, who lost. Very, very simple descriptive. The second stage, though, is going to be all about explain why who won, why who voted for whom, explain or interpret results. In that sense, we're a little bit like historians who are always trying to explain things that happen. But if we take seriously the idea that political science is a science, there's a certain aspect here that's all about prediction. And what I want to do in my talk today is I'm going to be moving back and forth across a variety of different time frames. I'm initially going to take you back about 2 years, bring us up to the present, take us back, and then eventually get us up to the present again in terms of trying to understand the election. The other thing that I want you to know up front, I haven't resolved something in my mind yet, and you'll see my presentation today. Theory number one is that at the national level, Kamala Harris could have won the presidential election, but for a series of mistakes. Theory number two, excuse me, I'm sorry. Theory number two was that no Democrat could have won the presidential election this year. So I'm going to lay out sort of both arguments here, and I'll be curious for you folks to tell me what you think. So now, since Rick Kruger and I waste too much time talking to one another all the time, I'm going to make Rick be my protagonist here, so to speak. So let us say, for example, Rick and I were talking about 2 years ago, talking right around this time, mid-December of 2022, after the midterm elections. And Rick would have asked me some kind of a question along the lines of, all right, so who do you think's going to be the presidential candidates in 2024? And what do you think is going to happen? This is all about the prediction aspect. So here's what I would have said to Rick 2 years ago. I would have said, this is really kind of interesting in terms of thinking about the race. By this time 2 years ago, Donald Trump had declared that he was going to run for president of the United States. There was some dispute leading up to it, but by this time he had firmly and officially declared that he was going to run. He was also facing at that point several legal challenges in terms of criminal charges, in terms of or pending criminal charges as growing out of either his presidency or other things. The second thing I would have told you at this point is that Joe Biden is now going to run for president of the United States. Now, I get to tell you some fun stories in the process today of my presentation. Now, about late November 2 years ago, I got a call from a friend of mine who lives out in the western suburbs of the Twin Cities. And he's the national or leading expert on generations in business. And what I mean by that, he writes books, gives talks, goes to companies and talks about how do you market across generations, like to millennials or baby boomers or Gen Zs. He gives talks all about what are workplaces like, what are millennials looking for, and so forth. Anyhow, David is a good friend of mine, David Stillman, that's his name. And David calls me, and he knew that I was finishing up my book on generational politics. And this is the story that's interesting. David calls me and he says, Stillman, not me. He says, I just got a call from the Peter Buttigieg campaign. Remember, this is late November. And he says, Peter Buttigieg is getting ready to announce that he's going to step down as Secretary of Transportation in the Biden administration, and that he's going to declare that he's going to run for president of the United States. I said, okay, this is an interesting story. And David said, I had mentioned to the Buttigieg people that you were just finishing up this book all about generational politics. And they were like, oh, we'd kind of like to talk to Schultz, see if he's got any interesting ideas. So David calls me and he says, are you willing to talk to the Buttigieg people? And I say, sure, talk is cheap. I'll talk to anybody. That talk never occurred. The reason why that talk never occurred is that between the time I spoke to David and he got back to the Buttigieg campaign, Biden had announced that he was going to run for president of the United States. Now, the reason why I tell you this story is that even people who were close to Joe Biden, his Secretary of Transportation, as well as others, were fully expecting that Joe Biden was going to live up to the words that many of us had heard back in 2020. when Joe Biden said something to the effect of, I'm a transitional president, I'm running one term, whatever it may be. But clearly, Buttigieg's decision not to step down was obvious, because if you now know your sitting president is going to run for president again, you're not going to challenge him. I just tell you this because 2 years ago, even into November, people closest to Biden were assuming he wasn't going to run again. So now Rick is still asking me the question, what am I thinking about for 2024? Well, what I would have told you based upon the polls going back to 2022, remember this is 2 years ago, I would have said that about 70% of the public was not looking forward to seeing a Trump-Biden rematch. They really wanted a different set of choices. We would also know that about 60 to 65% of the American population was concerned about the cognitive capacities of Joe Biden. Okay. Looking at the national polls, what I would have told you is that in the national polls at this point 2 years ago in December, that the race was close. That in most of the credible national polls, Washington Post, New York Times, let's say Siena, the better polls out there, that the race was about, with Trump, a 1 or 2 point lead over Joe Biden, with a margin of error in the polls of roughly plus or minus 3 or 4 points, and about 5 to 6% undecided. There was also a lot of people at that point who were also indicating, as I mentioned to you, they were not satisfied with the choices. They were looking at other people such as Robert Kennedy Jr., perhaps as a candidate. But I would have also told you, as all of you know, that ignore all national polls when it comes to presidential politics, because we don't elect the president by national popular vote, that it's the Electoral College. I would have told you, and all of you know, that the most important number in American presidential politics is 270. And what I mean by 270, that's how many electoral votes you need to win the presidency. I would have also been able to tell you that 2 years ago, that if we added up all the safe states, all the states that we knew that were going to vote for Joe Biden, the New Yorks, the Californias, the Massachusetts, if we looked at all the states that we were pretty certain to vote for Donald Trump, the Oklahomas, the Texases, the Utahs, I would have told you that neither Biden nor Trump had enough electoral votes to get to 270. They both were somewhere around 230 electoral votes. I would have told you 2 years ago that there were 7 states, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, that carried the balance of the power. These were the 7 swing states that were going to decide the election. That I would have also told you that within those 7 states, it was going to come down to a few swing voters in a few swing counties in those few swing states that were going to decide the election. 2 years ago, I would have said something to the effect of, let's say, roughly 5% of the voters and maybe a half a dozen counties across about 6 or 7 states would determine how to get to 270. I would have also said that the polls were very, very close. In all of those 7 swing states, we would have seen Trump with a slight lead of about 1 or 2 points in all 7 of those swing states, plus or minus in the polls, a margin of error of roughly 2 to 3 to 4 points, and still about 5 to 7% of the voters undecided. What I would have told you, and you actually, if you want to Google my name, you can find this. I would have said 2 years ago at roughly this time, the election was going to come down to about 150,000 to 200,000 voters strewn across a small number of swing states that were going to decide the election. That would have been our picture roughly 2 years ago. Now, let me bring it forward to what we know now, and then I'm going to push us back again in a couple of time frames. Not at all the dust has settled. What becomes interesting to realize is that even though Biden was out, Harris replaced him. First off, this was one of the closest presidential elections in recent American history. with all the dust settling, Donald Trump won by about 1.5 percentage points. Guess what? That was well within what the polls were saying 2 years ago. Donald Trump wins all 7 swing states, most of them by about a percentage or so. All of that within what the polling was telling us 2 years ago. We know that I should say at the presidential level, I actually got it a little bit wrong. I thought the election was going to come down to 150,000 to 200,000 voters, when in fact, had Kamala Harris picked up 230,000 more votes appropriately distributed across Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, she would be the electoral college winner for the presidency. Consistent with what we knew 4 years ago, where had Trump picked up 43,000 more votes across Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin, he would have been reelected as president, or 8 years earlier, where had Secretary Clinton won 91,000 more votes in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, she would have won the presidency. The point being is that an incredible small number of voters determined the presidential election. In the US House, shift about 9,000 votes across 3 House seats in California and Arizona, the Democrats would have a majority in the House of Representatives by a whisker. And more voters voted for Democrat candidates for the US Senate than voted for Republican candidates. The only picture I am trying to capture for you folks at the national level is that this was an incredibly close election. But all the closeness broke in favor of the Republicans and broke in favor of Donald Trump. And what amazes me, from 2 years ago up to the present, the incredible consistency in terms of the polls, the incredible consistency in terms of the numbers, that nothing significant really shifted in 2 years in terms of what the polls were telling us and in terms of the final results, speaking to perhaps the incredible polarization and the degree to which at the national level, the American public had made up their mind. All right. I want us to keep that in mind. And I'm going to eventually come back to it, because it does either suggest to me, along with some other data here, either that this was always an election that Donald Trump was going to win, he had a slight advantage, or it was an election that perhaps Harris could have won, again, but for some mistakes. Okay, so now I really want to move us back in time, because I'm going to be giving you now what I call my long-term and my short-term analysis of this election. Okay. To do my longer-term analysis here, I want to take us back to, let's say, the early 1960s. And here's the picture I want to paint for you. A picture of American politics, and I think it's also a picture of Minnesota politics in the process here. But at the national level, if you were to ask me, and Rick would have said to me, or maybe Teresa or somebody else who's there today would say to me, David, tell me a little bit about the Democratic and Republican parties in the 1960s, early 60s. And I would have said to you, well, the Democratic Party, including the DFL, would have been what? It would have been working class, it would have been farmers, it would have been laborers. It would have been a high percentage of people who were Democrats who didn't have a college degree. In fact, might not have even gone to college. In fact, might not have even had a high school degree. It would have been, again, the white working class, Roman Catholic, Jewish. It would have been also people who predominantly worked in manufacturing in the United States, and people who mostly lived in rural areas and, like I said, urban centers. But the working class was critical. This was a carryover from the Roosevelt coalition, the idea that the Democratic Party held together working class. It was at a time also when, and maybe some of you fit into this, in my case, it's my father who fit into it, that You could go off and work in manufacturing. You could go off and work for Ford, US Steel. You could work for Westinghouse. Join the union, make a pretty good paycheck, live your version of the American dream, and things were okay. The Republican Party, early 1960s, would have been a party of better educated, college educated, suburban areas. It would have been sort of mainline Protestant. It was a party that was not attracting very many voters in the South. The Democratic Party was attracting voters in the South. And that would have been our picture. One last picture also is that what the glue that held American politics together back then was the Cold War consensus. Whatever disagreement the Democrats and Republicans had amongst one another, there was a common consensus that we had to beat the Russians. We had to beat the Soviet Union. And that Cold War consensus held together agreements across the Democratic and Republican parties, which were ideologically quite diverse at that point. Okay. Now, you're asking me, Schultz, why are you going way back in time to tell you this story? Because I want to argue that starting in the 60s, the origins of the coalition that has now formed behind Donald Trump starts to form nearly 60 years ago. Phrased another way, if you accept this version of my argument, the roots of Trumpism are more than a half a century long. Okay. But think about the early 60s, relatively peaceful, but then it all changes in November 63 with Kennedy's assassination. Over the next several years, Kennedy is assassinated, his brother is killed, 2 civil rights leaders are assassinated. The country is torn over the Vietnam War. Lots of divide. Excuse me for a second. In 1968, with the country torn over the Vietnam War and culturally torn, Richard Nixon runs as the law and order candidate. He runs as a candidate saying that there is the silent majority out there. It's largely being ignored, largely feeling like they're alienated from all these cultural shifts that are going on. And he appeals to them. He speaks to them, and he's successful. At the same time, 1964, the Democrats stand behind civil rights. The right thing to do, but that starts a chain reaction in terms of the Democrats starting to lose the South, which used to vote solidly for the Republicans. And then in 1973, with Roe versus Wade being decided, the Democrats embrace both civil rights, rights for women, reproductive rights, eventually LGBTQ rights. And the reason why I mention this is that the cultural divide starts to open up, that those white working class, the majority of the voting population in the United States that care about workplace issues, they care about employment. These are, if I can use the analogy here, these are the Iron Rangers in Minnesota. They start to feel like the Democrats aren't speaking to them anymore. They're talking about other types of issues. And the Democrats start to lose them. They start to gravitate over to Nixon, then eventually to Reagan. But something else happens also. Barry Bluestone, Bennett Harrison wrote a wonderful book called The Great U-Turn in the 70s and early 80s. And they point out that in the 70s and the 80s, American manufacturing disappeared or started to disappear. They calculate that approximately 37 million manufacturing jobs in the United States disappeared either by moving north to south, disappeared by going overseas, or disappeared in the sense of being replaced by technologies that didn't need as many people, or just the fact that we weren't making these things anymore. Things that we used to make, we stopped making for a whole bunch of reasons. And what happened in the 70s, 80s, is that when this happened, the gap between the rich and poor started to explode. We now know that contemporary America has the greatest gap between the rich and poor of any point in American history. But in the 80s, the gap starts to expand. Those people who used to work at U.S. Steel, at let's say Firestone, the Ford plant in St. Paul. I think it was a Westinghouse plant on the east side of St. Paul, if I remember correctly. Again, I didn't come here till '86, so I don't know all the history of the state here. Those jobs disappear. And while I have nothing against McDonald's and nothing against Walmart, these displaced workers were not in a position to retrain. At best, oftentimes, they got jobs as greeters or burger flippers or whatever at McDonald's or at Walmart, paying substantially less than they got before. But at the same time, what happens as we start to deindustrialize, the American economy transforms in the 90s around computers, eventually around the internet, around high tech. And the people who are going to succeed, the people who are going to be the winners in the new economy, are those that got college degrees. They are the people who are going to have those new jobs where the economy is going and do incredibly well. And the Clinton administration embraces that. But the Clinton administration embraces something else also: free trade. Now, in the early 90s, I was teaching in San Antonio, Texas, at Trinity University. Less than a mile from where I was teaching is where the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, was signed. And everybody in San Antonio was excited about NAFTA, arguing it's going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread and people are going to make tons of money. And I remember this, it's a personal story, because they wanted to do a forum. They wanted to do a talk down there all about the beauty of free trade. And somebody at one point said, gosh, we probably need some village idiot to argue against free trade. And so I volunteered. I became the village idiot. And I argued and said, like many others, that free trade is going to make the country fabulously wealthy, but it's going to have winners and losers. We're going to lose jobs, manufacturing jobs even more, jobs that working class, including persons of color, were taking, and they're going to disappear. And it happened. The Democratic Party becomes the party of free trade, of NAFTA, becomes the party of high tech. Now, maybe bring us to 208, 209, 210, and then I'm going to get us to 216. I'm going to get us up to where we need to be in a couple of minutes here. Now think about 2008. Global economic crash occurs. Banks fail in the United States and ricochet across the world in terms of bringing down the global economy. George Bush, as president, starts off with a program called TARP, Troubled Assets Relief Program, a program that's going to bail out the banks. We commit, I don't know, hundreds of billions of dollars for it. Obama comes in as president. He takes over TARP. He takes over. He appoints as his Secretary of Treasury Tim Geithner. We still don't have a full accounting of how many hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars were used to bail out the banks, to bail out the too big to fail, to bail out General Motors. But what we do know is that at one point when Tim Geithner was asked the question, what about all those homeowners across the country who are going to lose their homes, including, by the way, in places like Edina, including places like Eden Prairie. Some of you may or may not know the largest food shelf in the state of Minnesota is down in Bloomington, and it serves that community, by far the largest one. When Geithner was asked, what about all those homeowners in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, who are going to lose their homes? What are we going to do? And Geithner said, well, it's unfortunate, but a lot of these people are going to have to lose their homes so that we can bail out the too big to fail. I tell this story because now we get to 2016. We've got a candidate named Donald Trump who has honed his image for 17 years on The Apprentice. understanding how to speak to the American public. He says in his acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention, the Republicans don't care about you. The Democrats don't care about you. Only I can fix your problems. The reason why I tell the story, Trump's support comes from a half a century among many workers. Iron Rangers in Minnesota is a great example of people who cared intensely about their jobs, who cared about what I call milk, bread, and eggs, about the cost of gas. They're seeing a Democratic Party that's not talking about those issues, a party that has embraced the college educated, the elite, the new economy, that a party that does not help the homeowners. And thus Trump wins in 2016. Now, yes, there was misogyny. I think that really affected Clinton, but Clinton also made major mistakes. Some of you might recall Bernie Sanders beats her 2-1 when we still had the caucuses in Minnesota. He beats her in the Wisconsin primary. He beats her in the Michigan primary. She violated in the general election the cardinal rule of Tip O'Neill. Never take a vote for granted, always ask for him. She never came back here to campaign, Michigan or Wisconsin. She made a fundraising trip solely to Allegheny County, Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, and she lost the election. Lost the election by making a variety of strategic mistakes. 4 years later, the Democrats regroup behind Joe Biden and they beat Donald Trump. And they think Trump is done. We've beaten him. When in fact, remember again, as I told you, 43,000 votes, Trump wins re-election. But Trump loses, I think, mostly because of his gross mishandling of the pandemic. Globally, all the regimes that were in place during the pandemic were ousted for backlash. But I remember at one point Trump saying, if only 500,000 people die because of COVID under my presidency, that should be considered a success. Probably not the right answer. But the reason why I tell you this, I now get us back to the beginning of my talk here, is that when Trump loses, the Democrats think he's done for. Biden runs, he's the one-termer. He says, I'm the transitional candidate. We then get us to 2 years ago. In the spring of 2022, midterm elections, things are not looking good for Biden and the Democrats. Biden has an approval rating of about 39%, about where Trump was 4 years earlier. 65% of the public is concerned about his cognitive capacities. 70% of the country is saying the country is going in the wrong direction. Democrats are looking like they're going to be destroyed in midterm elections, typical of the president's party losing badly in midterm elections. But then the Democrats get bailed out. They get bailed out when the Supreme Court, end of June 2022, overturns Roe versus Wade and says abortion is no longer protected. And the Democrats were able to eke out enough votes in 2022 to hold the Senate. And had they campaigned more strategically, not taken for granted seats in New York and California, they would have held on to the House. But remember, that was an incredibly close election, decided by just a few seats, a few votes that tip on the one level in the House for the Republicans, on the one level for the Senate for the Democrats. In Minnesota in 2022, think about how close the elections were there also. Move about 2,000 votes in a couple of Senate races in Minnesota, state Senate races. The Republicans have a 34-33 in the Senate. I'm going to be slightly off, but pretty close. Move less than 4,000 or 5,000 votes, maybe even less, in some critical House races, and the Republicans would have held the Senate or held at Minnesota or taken the Minnesota House of Representatives. An election that was basically what? It came down to some voters said it was the economy. Some voters said it was abortion. In some cases, it tipped one way, it tipped another. Neither party had a mandate. But Biden, now, beginning of my story, 2 years ago, hearing that Trump is going to run again. Biden convinced that abortion is going to help them, convinced that the economy is doing well, convinced that only he can beat Trump, declares he's going to run. 2 years ago, I told you it's neck and neck. The beginning of this year, it's neck and neck before the primaries. Same polling data is saying nationally close, slight lead to Trump. It's critical 7 swing states, pretty close, slight lead to Trump across them. We go through the primaries, we get into early June, the numbers are saying the exact same thing. A close race, but slightly favoring Trump. But also in the process, the American public is still saying 39% approval rating for Biden, saying that 70% don't like the direction of the country. They're concerned about the economy. Still about 70% are saying they don't like the choice of the 2 candidates. Then June 27th happens. That debate, the debate between Biden and Trump. And what that debate did was to set off approximately about a 3-month or so gyration in the presidential race that ended 2 weeks before the election. And I'll mention why in a second here. Okay. A quick side story also about one of my students. It was the fall of 2023 in one of my intro American politics classes. One of my female students turned to me and she said at one point, you know, I have a grandfather the same age as Joe Biden. I said, okay. A lot of my students do have grandfathers somewhere in the era. And she said to me, my grandfather has good and bad days. And we all know what she meant. We all have relatives like that, good and bad days. But then she said something devastating. She said, we only see Joe Biden on his good days. What do you think he's like on his other days? And I thought to myself, that's a really significant comment. And whatever we may think of Joe Biden, that debate tapped into the fears that the American public had. And what becomes fascinating from June 27th until 2 weeks, before the election is a variety of things. Is that Biden in, Biden out, Harris in, Harris searching for a vice presidential candidate, goes against conventional wisdom and opts not for Shapiro or Kelly, opts for our governor, a Republican convention, a national Democratic convention, 2 attempted assassinations, a September 10th debate between Harris and Trump, in which it looks like, according to the American public, Harris has won pretty decisively. What I'm getting at is during this period from June 27th until 2 weeks before the election, there is some indication that Harris might be able to win this election. She raises more money in a shorter period of time than any presidential candidate in American history. There are some polls that are suggesting that the gap is narrowing, but still, even during this time period, the polls are saying either Harris up by a point, down by a point, Trump by a point, down by a point, with the polls saying still margin of errors of roughly 3 to 4 points and about 4 to 5% undecided. This is the part where I now am not sure. Could Harris have won this one? She made some strategic mistakes. Mistake number 1 is that she went very conventional in terms of her where she decided to appear. Conventional in the sense that she went on Fox, she went on CNN, she went very, very traditional places to reach people. Trump, on the other hand, went the podcast route. He went the alternative media. And at a time when the American public is shifting, has been rapidly shifting from traditional old school media to new media, social media. That was important. Second, it's about the messaging. And what I mean by the messaging is that when Biden was saying, and then Harris, that the economy is doing well, if I can put it into the metaphor of streets, maybe things were going well on Wall Street, record numbers, maybe even on Main Street where businesses are. But when it came down to the Elm Streets, the Oak Streets where people live, things were not being felt so well. That it was about milk, bread, and eggs. I teach at Hamline University. About 2 weeks before the election, I live south of 94. I live a couple miles south of Hamline University. And I stopped into the Cub in Midway. I need to pick up a few grocery items. And ahead of me was a woman, and it's important to know something about her details. She was Hispanic, looked like she was in her early 30s. She was in the register, the line ahead of me. She picked up 6 containers of powdered infant formula for her family. The cash register rang up. Those 6 containers were $140. My eyes bugged out of my head. Hers bugged out. Everybody did. And she looked at it and she said, I can't afford this. She put it back and came back with a case of ramen noodles. This is not good. She walked out of there and I thought to myself, this is a person, if she votes, is not going to vote for Harris, even though by all the demographics she should. Because to her life is not better off because the price of milk, bread, eggs, diapers, and infant formula. When Biden and then Harris are saying the economy is doing so well, they're missing the day-to-day. The day-to-day stuff. This is the James Carville argument from a long time ago. It's the economy, but it's more than the economy. It was about prices. But then I think, yes, I do know, and I would argue Harris was also a victim of sexism, was probably a victim of racism. But the other mistake that I would list, she was on The View 2 weeks before the election. Softball question was asked of her, something to the effect of, if you were president, what would you do differently than Biden? And she looked in the camera and said, I can't really think of anything. In an election where 70% of the American public wanted change, were not happy with the status quo, her failure to articulate what she would do differently, failure to break with Biden, reminiscent of Al Gore and Bill Clinton in 2000, those of you who are long-term Minnesotans, Humphrey's failure to break with Johnson back in '68. And in close elections, that mattered. She failed to articulate that difference. We could literally look at 2 weeks out from the election when she said that, the polls froze. And in those last 2 weeks, those 5% undecided voters in some polls were down to 2 to 3%. As they decided, they do, and this is where Rick and I talk all the time. I argue that when undecided voters decide to vote, 60% of them break against the incumbent. Rick thinks it's a higher percentage. Maybe he's right. I don't know. But those undecided voters did what undecided voters do when they're unhappy with the status quo. They broke against her. The reason why I tell all of this, is it possible that Harris could have won the election, given how close it was, had she not made these mistakes? Maybe, I don't know. Or do you accept the alternative hypothesis that there's a bunch of long-term economic, cultural forces that came together that would have made it nearly impossible for any Democrat to win this time? I don't know which theory I want to ascribe to here. Give me about 2 more minutes, and I want to stop here and then open it up for questions. And I can go beyond 1 o'clock if you folks want to go here. Okay. The concept I want to introduce to you now is the concept that political scientists talk about. It's called critical elections. There's a fascinating book. It was written 50 years ago by Walter Dean Burnham called Critical Elections in the Mainsprings of American Politics. He's not the only person to write about this. People still write about it now. But his argument is that, and all of you know this, political parties are composed of voters. They're composed of coalitions. They're composed of blocs. Parties represent interests. The goal of a party is to get elected, to hold the votes together, and to deliver on public policies to get reelected again. That, in a nutshell, is about politics. What Burnham argues, and other political scientists, is about every 30 or 40 years, we have a critical reelection that redefines voting patterns, that changes loyalties in the election, resulting in new coalitions. The story that I've been telling you is a story that says that from the New Deal into the 60s, the Democrats were the party of the working class, eventually the party of people of color, eventually the party of Roman Catholics. The embracing of the Civil Rights Revolution. Again, I'm not saying I think they shouldn't have. The transformation of the economy. The Democrats lost many of these voters. When we look at the exit polling data, we saw not just finally white working class have just all but abandoned the Democratic Party, but even persons of color, especially males, working class, have shifted over to the Republican Party. We even saw, in many cases, college-educated suburban women shifting more to the right. In Minnesota, we saw that also too, even in Hennepin and Ramsey counties. What is going on here, going back to 2008 through these last few elections, is a critical realignment of American politics at this point. It is a culmination of what's been going on for many years, where the Democrats are largely becoming the party of affluent, college-educated, urban, to some extent, suburban voters. The Republicans are picking up everybody else. In the most recent exit polls, the Democratic Party nationwide comes in third. Republicans are the first choice, independents second, Democrats third. This is a pretty significant shift that is going on in terms of politics. And in Minnesota, if I can sort of tie this up here, is that it's a shift. Now, I put together kind of a handout here, and I can send this out to everybody here. It's called Understanding Minnesota Politics. It's kind of like a cheat sheet on some trends here. Well, let me just give you a couple of interesting numbers here, and I'll wrap it up here. Okay, so think about when Tim Walz ran for governor the first time in 2016. He won with, actually, I'll correct myself. When Tim Walz's, 2016 is Tim Walz's last election for Congress. Okay, first district. In 2016, he wins 50.34% to 49.58%. Okay, very close election, but he still wins. In 2018, Walz runs for governor the first time. He wins 21 of Minnesota's 87 counties with 53.84% of the vote. He wins 8 of the counties that were in his old CD District 1. In 2022, Tim Walz, running for a second term as governor, wins 12 of the 87 counties. That means he's down 9 already, with 52.2%, 52.2% of the vote. Actually, a smaller percentage of the statewide vote than before. He wins 4 of the counties that he had previously won. He previously would have had his congressional district. In 2024, as presidential candidate, vice presidential candidate, Walz and Harris only win 9 counties. When Biden had run for president in 2020, he had only won 13. Walz and Harris get 51.1% of the vote. What I'm getting at here is that the Democrats are down to the point now where they're winning only about 10 counties in Minnesota. Granted, they're the most populous, but their base has tremendously shrunk. And Walz himself, in 3 successive statewide campaigns, is winning fewer counties and getting a lower and lower percentage of the overall state vote. None of these are numbers that are good for Waltz. And all of these are numbers that are suggesting, not a surprise, that Minnesota politics is as competitive as it is. All right, let me stop there. I probably have talked way too much. I should let it open up to you folks to ask me a whole bunch of questions. So as I like to say to my students, questions, comments, or nasty remarks are all perfectly appropriate.
This is Teresa, and
Hi,
that was
Teresa.
fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And I made a lot of notes because I think better when I write. But I am confused about the Dean Phillips issue.
That's my question as well.
How does he play into it? Where was his vision before the Democrats? Can you explain a little bit about that?
Okay, okay. Dean's he's a fascinating figure on so many different ways. On one level, is Dean Phillips the case of shooting the messenger? And what I mean by that is that when he says 2 years ago, calls and says that Biden shouldn't run for, or a year and a half ago, shouldn't run for reelection, he's speaking to, I think, what a lot of people were thinking is that Biden said only one term, he's not going to run again. Now, I don't think Phillips, if I remember correctly, was referencing anything about Biden's cognitive capacities, but clearly he's sensing that the numbers are not moving well for him. Phillips might have had the right message, but a third-term Congress member is probably not the right messenger at that point. Maybe somebody more senior who had said something. I don't know. I'm not going to. I don't know. Maybe a Betty McCollum, maybe a Klobuchar. I don't know. I'm just speculating here. But he's an odd figure. But the fact that he did that and then ran almost kind of a Don Quixote campaign for president, very hard to explain. Now, I'll also say, I'll just do stories here. I know, probably many of you know him too. When he decided to run for Congress the first time, I had no idea who he was. He calls me out of the clear blue sky and says, "I'm Dean Phillips. I own a big liquor company. Can I come and talk to you?" And I said, "I guess." And he says, "I'm thinking of running for Congress. What do you think?" And so we had a cup of coffee, talked about it, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't know. He's an odd figure that was also a rising star, clearly for the Democrats, and threw it all away. So I don't know how to explain it. I've not been in contact with Dean in years, and so I don't know what he's thinking. But you're asking a good question, Teresa, because I mean, clearly, I don't know. Some people were thinking, I don't know, U.S. Senator, maybe governor of Minnesota, who knows? But certainly to go from three-term Congress, take on the president. I don't know. Maybe he thought he was Eugene McCarthy 50 years later. I don't know. Who else?
Jim Castro here.
Hi, Jim.
Do you have any sense or logic of what's going on in Minneapolis and St. Paul in terms of the kind of the self-appointed socialists who seem to be trying to operate the cities? Is this going to continue? Is it part of the partisan party process? Is there any hope for normalcy?
Yeah. Well, what we're seeing is, of course, one of my favorite books in the last few years is Bill Bishop's book, The Big Sort, about how Democrats and Republicans have sorted themselves out geographically. We shop at different stores, we eat at different restaurants, et cetera, et cetera. But I think, whether correct or incorrect, and I leave that up to you folks to decide here, is that the cities have become sort of real urban enclaves, real liberal progressive enclaves, and Minneapolis, and to some extent St. Paul. I think the messages that are coming out of 2024 is that if nationwide or at the federal level is going to go far right. They're moving far left at this point. It's kind of like, well, we've got to become kind of the enclaves at the local level. Well, the data for what the election overall means is, if I'm interpreting it correctly, is that what the public really cares about is what? Milk, bread, and eggs. If you catch my metaphor, you know what I'm getting at here. They care about the fact that, they want safe streets, they want quality schools. And I just don't see right now, I'm going beyond being a political scientist right now. I just don't see how the politics in Minneapolis and St. Paul is resonating with those day-to-day quality of life issues. I would also say, by the way, I'm not sure that the Republican Party is also listening to where the American public is at this point either. I mean, I think both parties are appealing to the extremes of their party and not sort of listening into where I still think where most voters are.
Question, in terms of the Democrats losing a lot of traditional Democratic voters, people of color, working people, do you think that was largely the economy, and how much of it was because of the immigration issue?
Well, certainly. Hi, Phil, by the way. It's been a while since we talked.
Yeah.
Clearly I think you have to link them together here. Okay. The reason why, as I was going to say, is that when people are trying to, what Trump has done really well is, and I don't necessarily say I agree with it, but when the working class are saying, where are my jobs? Why am I not being paid as well as I used to? The thing that he did was to link it to immigration right off the bat, is to say, well, the reason why you've lost your job is because of the Chinese or because of the immigration, et cetera, et cetera. So he clearly appealed to both economic and racial fears at the same time together. So I don't think you can separate the two of them out from one another here. But one of the things I've had other people have asked me the question here is that what Trump also did, and again, not necessarily saying I agree with it, he spoke to the fears, the prejudices, the anxieties of a lot of working class. That if my analysis is correct here, and I don't know, and I may not be, when Biden and Harris are saying the economy is doing well and the cost of milk, bread, and eggs has gone up, or those 6 containers, whatever, as I told you, of infant formula are costing $144 or something. There's kind of a sense of a tin ear out there for the Democrats. And I think the Democrats have sort of missed that. Is that I think it's still about the bread and butter issues. On one level, Bernie Sanders, I think, is right, but he's the wrong messenger. Right in the sense that if the Democrats want to do well, they have to be talking about basic quality of life issues. And I think so. I think it's a combination of the race, it's the immigration, it's the quality of life issues that are out there. But I also think, to some extent, it's taking voters for granted. Tip O'Neill's great line: "Ask for every vote. Don't assume people." But also, I was generating some numbers earlier today, just for the heck of it here. And this is the Census Bureau, by the way. And what it points out here, this is really interesting, and I don't have the Minnesota numbers, is that 62% of the American adult population has not graduated from college. Only 38% have. And the reason why I mention this is that the largest voting bloc in America is people who are without college education. And the Democrats have narrowed their base to becoming more and more just college educated people. That's not a good winning formula. Now, I'll say I don't know how the Democrats bring back the working class. I also don't know how the Republicans hold on to the working class either. I don't see either of the parties really talking about those day-to-day issues that I think most people are concerned about. That's my sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Professor.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Pat McGowan, and I was first elected in 1988 in the special election.
Okay.
And I found your comparisons, your long-term, extremely interesting, and your analysis of coming forward. But just a couple of things is you made the analogy between when I entered the legislature, the Iron Range in Minneapolis controlled.
Yep.
There was no doubt about it.
Of course. Yep.
They controlled. And I came from Hibbing, Minnesota.
Okay, good.
I was an Iron Ranger.
All right.
And obviously, my first election and a special election in 1988, I was fortunate enough to win.
Good.
But in 1990 and 1992, I not only won, but I had Minnesota AFL-CIO, Minnesota Teamsters, Minnesota Teachers, Chamber of Commerce, Minnesota Medical. And I think it goes back to talking to people, be willing to talk to both sides, not pick your side and be an adversary. And my colleagues elected me as the assistant Republican leader after 2 years, which I was very privileged to have.
Nice.
And again, when I left the legislature, same thing when I became Hennepin County Sheriff, the same endorsements followed me with that. But a couple of things that I look at is that you go back to 1990 and you talk about the bread and eggs issues. I live in Arizona and have been, since I retired, live here. Immigration, huge issue with the border. And I think it's where people live where they pick their issues.
Yeah.
Is you look in Minnesota, taxes.
Yep.
That's by some people. I also think when you made the analogy, when you talked about the softball question on The View, I'm not sure that any of those help Harris at all. I mean, do normal people really, when I say normal, middle class people, do they sit at home and watch The View? I don't think so.
Yeah.
And I look at that, and then when you looked at who Vice President Harris went to for support, were a lot of the Hollywood fame stars that the average person has no connection with. No connection. I mean, they have the money. They talk about we should all be open, yet all their mansions all have electronic gates. They have private security guards that are armed. Yeah. Kind of a different world for them than for the average person. And so I think you raised a lot of great points, especially when you talked about the cultural divide and the roots of Trumpism going back and that. So I think people, candidates running in the future, you just can't be for what you have to know what the people in the states where you're campaigning really feel. Where's the average person? Because in Arizona, you talked about political parties of independent. So Arizona, you know what the largest political party is? Independents.
I'm not surprised. Not surprised. Yeah.
And Republicans are second and Democrats are third. But in the way that we have to vote, we don't ever get to vote for an independent in a primary election. We are forced to either have to vote Democrat or Republican.
Yeah.
Independent. So I think people, as we go forward, we just need to have candidates that can look at middle-class people of what you're talking about are the eggs and the jobs, pensions, retirement, medical costs, all of that. And who do they believe? Because I disagree. I don't think that Trump lost the election because of the pandemic. I thought because he was an arrogant individual.
Okay, fair enough.
And so That's it for me, but I
David,
want to thank you for your comment.
David, just to follow up before you answer to what Pat is saying is, it also doesn't make sense to me if, you know, Pat is right and the Democrats rely too much on celebrities. Well, Donald Trump himself is a celebrity, and Elon Musk, a billionaire, is his big buddy, and all the billionaires he's appointed to be secretary of this or that. So it seems to me that I mean, I don't know if the Democrats aren't supporting the working class and the Republicans don't appear to be supporting the working class. Are they all just going to become independents?
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say, Sandy. I was going to say, that's sort of one of my points here is that I don't feel like right now, if the polls are correct, and the analysis is correct here, working class doesn't feel like the Democrats are supporting them. But also, I look at the composition of Trump's cabinet and look at his first term in office. You know, his first term, I can't really point to anything that he did in his first term that I could say, gosh, as a farmer, as a laborer, you know, union member, I'm better off. You know, so I agree with you on that. I want to throw a couple other observations out here, by the way. Following up on Pat's comment here is that I actually think the most, and all of you know this, I think the most important skill in politics is active listening. It's listening to your constituents. It's not talking to them, but it's listening to them. And so I think that's the first thing. The second thing, just these are a couple of random observations here, is, and those of you, you know, you've all been elected to office, you know what I'm referring to here. Of the D and the F and the L, what's left of the F and the L for the Democrats in greater Minnesota? Not a lot anymore. Is that for good or for bad? You know, drive 30 miles out of the Twin Cities. The politics changed dramatically. And even I was going to say, was it a couple summers ago? I wanted to go to the Hockey Hall of Fame up in Eveleth. I've never been up there. I wanted to go see what the Hall of Fame was like that. And my wife went with me. And outside of every hotel, every business establishment up there was a sign that says support mining. And there is this dichotomy, and I don't know how to address this, is that there's the concern about the environment that the Democrats have in the Twin Cities, which is legitimate, but there's a concern about jobs, you know, in the Iron Range, which is also legitimate. You know, I mean, and we see a lot of Democrats have lost. A lot of people who were Democrats have walked away from the Democratic Party on issues like this. And then maybe the only other thing I want to throw out here on a different score, many years ago when I could actually do this, Brad Walton, who used to be at WCCO Radio, used to do an overnight radio show on the weekends. And once in a while, I would do the overnight show with him. I'd be a wreck the next day, but I would do this, you know, from 12 until 6. And he once asked people, he said, I want people of color who are out there, call in and tell me what issues are important to you. And somebody called in, I don't even know where they were, in the middle of nowhere. And he said, I'm African-American, and the issues I'm concerned about are pensions, schools, safe streets. And Brad said to him, those don't sound like issues of people of color. And the person shot back and said, yeah, those are the same issues that I care about that everybody else does. You know, that, and I thought there was a message in that story there. The idea that talk about the things that everybody is concerned about. That's the strategy.
Bob Vogel. And
Hi, Bob.
I kind of a numbers nerd, of course, but you didn't talk about finances. And both the federal and the state are in structural disorder.
Yeah.
And if you look even at the budget forecast, you're looking at a structural deficit in Minnesota now of $2.5 billion. So how do you see that affecting? Because I know most people will never pay attention to it until it happens. But when you're structurally this far in the hole with all of the issues that both the federal and the state governments face, do you see that becoming an issue, or does it just become more of the, you know, the general popularity that you use to run on?
Well, first off, as Sandy is signing off, I was about to say, I'm glad I don't have Sandy's job right now. I'm currently in the legislature, because it's not going to be pretty now dealing with, the next biennial budget, anticipating, I think actually it's a $5 billion deficit that's going to be coming at this point. But I mean, to me, if you think about it on one level, the most important issue at the federal level is what? Gap between the rich and the poor. We have a Social Security system that's insolvent in the next few years. I think what Medicare and Medicaid is insolvent. I mean, we've got some real major structural financial issues that are out there. And neither Trump nor Harris, Democrat or Republican, is talking about, I think, some of the most consequential issues in our society. They're not sexy, but those are real issues. And and at some point, we keep, my students keep saying, and rightly so, you baby boomers et al. Just keep kicking the can down the line, and now we're going to have to deal with it. And there's a sense in which a little bit of that is true. We're just kicking this problem down the line further. And I don't know how we have this real serious debate about I don't know, the affordability of our system, sort of the structural fairness. And I think it's going to be, not as a citizen, I say this, as a political scientist, I say this, it's going to be fascinating to watch the state legislature this year, where we now have we don't have $17 billion, surplus. We now have a hole. What's going to happen, and how's it going to affect the debates? I don't know. I wish I could give you a better answer, outside of saying that it's not a good picture to be in right now at the state or federal level.
I'm going to jump in here for a second too, and I'd say, I'd like to get your thoughts on, we're around the same issues that we're talking about. I mean, I grew up in the east side of St. Paul, even though I represented a rural district, and it was Whirlpool, Ham's Brewery, and 3M.
It was Whirlpool. That's what it was. I was thinking Westinghouse. It was Whirlpool. That's right.
A very large percentage of east side workers were blue collar workers in those factories, and frankly, those types of jobs don't exist anymore.
That's right.
And they're, interestingly, and contrary to what most people would probably think, manufacturing is and has been returning to the United States. It's just returning without the employees because of robotics and things like that. And I mean, what it takes to manufacture a car in terms of numbers of people moving through that factory is minuscule in comparison to what it was in the 1960s and 70s.
Yeah.
So, that's one thing that gets ignored altogether. The structural issues we've talked about here or have referenced, but a lot of the structural problems, I mean, when you have, let's take Social Security, which is, obviously is not a state issue, but the structural problem is you have people living longer than what the benefits will. And it's not a mismanagement of the funds or anything like that.
Right.
It's, you've got a structural problem there. I don't see either side taking up those issues and talking much about them, quite frankly.
No, I think you're right. I was going to say, when the original Social Security, when it was adopted, was assuming we're going to live maybe a half dozen years at most after retirement or something like that. But you're right. Now we've got, I've got friends who've retired at 62, average lifespan is another 18 years at that point, approximately like that. I mean, Social Security can't carry that weight. I mean, one of the other trends is we're an aging society. What I saw the other day, just in Minnesota, by 2030, was it going to be something like almost 30%? Is it 25 or 30% of the population is going to be 65 or older or something like that? I mean, we've got this.
Which means more healthcare costs. That's another structural problem.
Of course, more healthcare costs. Plus, we don't have the workforce that's there in terms of the ratio to support, because I can't remember what the original numbers were, how many workers it was per worker per Social Security recipient. I can't remember the numbers now off the top of my head.
Well, I can remember when it was originally formed, it was 20 to 1.
Yeah,
we're getting close to 2 to 1 right now.
I know. I mean,
for active versus retired, the active workers versus the retired Social Security recipient.
Yeah. I mean, these are the kind of conversations we really need to have. But I just don't see, maybe it's a leadership issue at this point, or a courage issue. I just don't see a lot of politicians wanting to say, let's have this serious discussion about these kind of issues. And by the way, we may have to I don't know. Maybe Walter Mondale was right back in 1984 when he said, both of us are going to raise your taxes. One of us is going to tell the truth, the other is not, or something like that. I mean, the lesson from Walter Mondale was don't tell the truth, I guess.
Well, nobody's going to be raising taxes in the coming year. And I think the legislative session is going to be very disappointing to a lot of people because it's going to be, for the most part, boring.
Yep.
They're not going to get a lot of major things done. They're going to pass a budget that's going to spend a little bit more money, somewhere between 0 and the 600 million that's available. The $1 billion problem isn't until the out years, as I understand it. So they don't have to address that. And so they're not going to address it.
Yeah.
And it could get better and it could get worse depending on what happens with the national economy. So Minnesota, it's going to be boring.
Yep.
Nationally, the shit is going to hit the fan when you have Musk and his sidekick. I mean, if they come in with 1/5 as much of cutting that they think they can get, that they actually go public with, and then there'll be the cadre of people in the House that will be perfectly willing to try to do it.
Yeah.
And that isn't going to happen.
That's right.
But it's going to cause major problems for the speaker. It's going to cause major problems for the Senate. And if we don't stumble into a war somewhere in the next 12 months, you're going to really see a reckoning in Congress, and it's going to get very ugly. And we probably will actually have a government shutdown in this coming year, because they're not going to be able to address passing a budget. And I'm going to buy a lot of popcorn, and I'm going to sit back and watch the shit show.
Yeah.
It's coming.
Yeah.
But you're going to be bored if you watch the Minnesota. There'll be a few moments where things will get a little exciting, but for the most part, the session is going to be a boring one because they're not going to be able to do anything dramatic on anything, including the budget. So when all is said and done, they'll have a budget done, maybe not the end of May, but by the end of June. But the real shit show is going to happen in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. Let me throw a couple more things into this here. Is that, there's all kinds of ways that people talk about the federal budget. One of them, they talk about mandatory versus discretionary spending, and what I mean by that, is, the discretionary means stuff that you could change relatively easy year to year. Is that, Musk keeps saying, well, we're just going to address the discretionary spending and cut there. What they want to cut would wipe out all the discretionary spending, and you would have to still take an axe to Social Security and Medicare to do anything what they want to do. So your point is well taken here. I was also thinking about the promise to get rid of the Department of Education. And I was talking to somebody the other day about this. Well, if you get rid of the Department of Education, who's going to administer all the programs for students with learning disabilities, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, these are popular programs too. I'm sort of reinforcing your point here, by the way, is that for them to do what they want to do, they have to go after some really popular and very sacred cow programs. And I think even in across a lot of districts across the country, when they start saying we're going to eliminate this, this, and this, there's going to be an awful lot of people who are going to be yelling at people from both political parties about this.
Well, they can still abolish the Department of
Right.
Education and still continue a lot of programs. They had funding for education coming
I know
from
before.
the government before there ever was a department.
Yeah, when it was still Hugh. It was still Hugh, yeah.
So I mean, they could do that, but they're not gonna cut the money.
I know.
You're right. They could wipe out everything, and they still are going to have a problem because you got to go where the real money is. The real money is Social Security, Medicare, and defense.
Yeah, yeah. The other thing is, if Trump is serious about the massive deportations, I mean, one of the contradictions that Trump had in his first term was, on the one hand, hates the quote deep state versus he wants to move a political agenda. You really can't do both of them at the same time because you need the administrative state to help you deliver and implement your programs. If he wants to do the kind of deportations that he says he wants to do, which I don't think are going to happen, the cost is going to be in the tens, if not the hundreds of billions of dollars, and it's going to need a bureaucracy the likes of which we've never seen in this country to be able to do something like that. So I think there's this contradiction in his second term. If I look at who he's appointing in terms of his cabinet officials, these are not people who are experts, let us say, in running major bureaucracies.
But see, you're assuming that
yeah,
he's actually serious about wanting to get rid of several million people.
I know
that isn't going to happen.
I know.
There's going to be some high profile deportation efforts, and there's going to be hopefully people that deserve to get kicked out, people that have committed crimes or whatever. And that's going to happen. But there isn't going to be, other than some very publicized, like I said, high profile instances. They're not going to deport all the people that are living here illegally.
I agree.
So it's going to be much ado about very little. But again, I get back to the shit show in particularly in the House of Representatives, where you got the true believers going to follow whatever Musk and his know-nothing sidekick come up with. They have no clue what they're talking about. Minus
Matt Gaetz, who and if you saw the news today, the House is going to release the report on Gaetz.
I did see it.
Yeah, interesting.
Well,
who else?
We're going to stay tuned, and I encourage you all to buy popcorn.
Great presentation, Professor. So good to see you. Thank you.
No problem, Phil. Good to see you again. Everybody stay warm and get your shovels ready for tomorrow.
Well, thank you very much. It was great.
Great. Thank you very much. Right. Bye.
Thank you.
Right. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Great program.